The incense hangs low in the cloister, a pale cloud drifting across cold stone. Chanting comes from behind a heavy wooden door. The rhythm is steady, the face of ritual unmoved. Candles throw long shadows on linen habits, and the world outside is kept at a hand's breadth by high walls and iron grills. On paper, these places were sanctuaries, houses of prayer, discipline, and sanctity. In the archives, a different picture keeps returning, one written in thin, bureaucratic hands and stamped by inquisitors. A story of repression, bodily control, and, in many cases, abuse. Archives show a different story: repression, abuse, and institutional silence. What the records reveal about intimate life inside medieval convents is at once mundane and alarming. Fasting that becomes starvation, penances that edge into harm, confession that becomes a channel for manipulation, and an institutional reflex to preserve reputation at the expense of those confined within. If you want more uncovered chapters from history's hidden archives, subscribe. Girls entered convents for reasons that, to modern eyes, can seem bluntly pragmatic. Daughters of middling or poor families were sent into cloisters as a way to secure dowries, relieve household expense, or honor a vow. Many were children, often between 12 and 15, whose lives were effectively decided by male relatives or local patrons. The consecration ceremony, when it occurred, was meant to be a lifelong bond, a formal renunciation of secular ties, a sealing away behind the rules of clausura. Once enclosed, autonomy was limited, movement was controlled, possessions were minimal, and contact with the outside world was mediated by male confessors, visitors approved by superiors, and clergy who held juridical power. The theology behind mortification was familiar. The body as a source of temptation, suffering as a pathway to sanctity. Mortification took many sanctioned forms. Fasting was practiced to discipline desire and invite spiritual clarity. Sleep could be curtailed as part of vigils. Hair might be cropped in symbolic humility. Flagellation and the use of hair shirts or knotted belts, cilices, were part of a spectrum of self-denial intended to tame the flesh. In doctrinal terms, these were acts of devotion. In practice, the line between devotion and harm was porous. Archival descriptions often use terms like rigorous penances or harsh mortifications. Other times they record the physical collapse, the fainting, the infections, the mental breakdowns. Records from different places and decades keep returning to a pattern. What begins as discipline can escalate when the person administering it holds unchecked authority. An inquisitorial file from Toledo, dated 1492, records women described as suffering convulsions, extreme fasting, and claimed visions. The file does not treat these as purely spiritual phenomena. It notes physical signs, emaciation, bleeding, and repeated fainting. An archival record from the Archive of Lisbon, 1624, connected to the Convent of Santa Clara, shows how official testimony could diverge sharply from women's accounts. Officially, symptoms were described in language of sanctity, ecstasy, divine visitation. But depositions from servants and some sisters mention coercive penances that left women debilitated. Mortification in its extreme forms was not merely accidental. It was embedded in a system that prized visible suffering as proof of holiness. Silence was cultivated. Confession, the sacramental channel meant to cure sin, could also be a site of control. The confessor, often a trusted male cleric, occupied a peculiar position. He heard the most intimate details of the sisters' consciences, set penances, and adapted spiritual regimes. In several archival cases, that position allowed exploitation. A Vatican letter dated 1520, preserved among clerical correspondence, warns of a confessor known as Father Francisco. The letter indicates that he used his access to manipulate certain women under his spiritual care, recommending penances that included excessive fasting and private meetings framed as counsel. The letter suggests ecclesiastical unease about his methods, noting reports that the confessor's practices do not accord with prudent pastoral care. Vatican Correspondence 1520, archival record. The language is cautious, the accusation is nonetheless clear. A man in power exploiting channels meant for solace. The instruments of control were both ideological and physical. Enclosure meant fewer witnesses. A mother superior presided over daily life with considerable latitude. Superiors could authorize extreme penances in the name of discipline. They controlled punishment and public narrative. The confessor's role could be ambivalent: spiritual father for the community, spiritual gatekeeper for individual sisters. When a member of that hierarchy transgressed, the institutional mechanisms for redress were weak and often protective of the institution. The Inquisition, whose remit included policing deviance, frequently interpreted extreme behavior through categories it understood: heresy, witchcraft, demonic influence, or feigned sanctity. The primary instinct in many documents is to preserve ecclesiastical authority. Victims' accounts were sometimes reframed as possession. Interrogations emphasized moral failing rather than institutional enabling. Several cases make the pattern painfully clear. The situation in San Placido, near Madrid, in 1609, is one such episode. Records of the San Placido inquiry describe a collective outbreak. Around 47 women reported convulsions, visions, and other extreme behaviors. The initial response framed these phenomena as demonic possession in need of exorcism. Inquisitorial investigators arrived and conducted interrogations and treatments aligned with their protocols. Yet the inquiry also recorded poor nutrition among the sisters, pressured vigils, and evidence of suggested penances. The official record oscillates between spiritual diagnosis and material observation. The women were both said to be possessed and demonstrably weakened by austerities. San Placido's files underline a recurring dynamic. Behaviors labeled supernatural were often entangled with physical deprivation and psychological strain. The case of Sister Maria provides a more intimate window. Identified in archival dossiers under a form of anonymity, sometimes named Sister Maria, she appears in a Toledo file as a young woman who began to experience episodes that were at once ecstatic and distressing. Testimony recorded in the file indicates that she went into trances during prayer, claimed visions, and refused food at times as a form of penance. Other depositions accompanying the file point to enforced penances that exceeded communal norms. Prolonged fasting, solitary confinement for recuperation, and repeated flagellation endorsed by a local superior. When complaints were brought forward, they were filtered through ecclesiastical structures that preferred to explain the episodes as either divine favor or demonic attack. The record notes both physical collapse and the reluctance of authorities to interrogate the motivations of those administering penance. In short, Sister Maria's suffering was both spiritualized and minimized. Pregnancy within a convent, when it appears in the archives, exposes the most acute contradictions of enclosure. Records show that pregnancies were not unheard of. When discovered, they were treated as scandalous evidence of breakdown within a sacred space. The responses were brutal and pragmatic. Children were sometimes removed. Mothers could be punished, publicly shamed, or forced to undergo penances framed as purification, but designed to erase the event. At times, the initial response was to search for a supernatural explanation: possession, immoral influence, but depositions and later inquiries sometimes revealed more prosaic routes: proximity to male agents, confessors, servants with access, hired laborers, opportunistic encounters, or coercion hidden behind spiritual authority. The archival documentary record is careful. It rarely draws a straight line without corroboration. More often it shows fragments: a birth certificate crossed out, a note of transfer for a suspected confessor, a sister removed for her own good, that taken together map institutional priorities. containment and reputation, rather than transparent justice. These harms did not always culminate in public trials. In many instances, perpetrators were moved to other assignments, quietly reassigned by superiors or subject to mild rebukes. The Vatican correspondence about Father Francisco, 1520, shows the Church weighing its options, trying to balance scandal avoidance with internal discipline. In some inquisitorial processes, the penalty for a cleric might be admonition or transfer rather than public censure. Victims, by contrast, risked punishment. The Inquisition's reach could mean interrogations that relied on coercive techniques, and its language frequently turned the narrative against the possessed or afflicted. Rather than probe the role of male agents, proceedings often sought spiritual explanations that affirmed ecclesiastical control. Punishments recorded in these files range from public penances and imprisonment to, in the most extreme and rare cases, capital sentences tied to heresy or witchcraft charges. The record from Toledo, 1492, mentions sisters subjected to punitive confinement and harsh penances. The Archive of Lisbon file, Santa Clara, 1624, records sisters removed from the convent and placed under custody after the discovery of pregnancies or scandal. The outcomes could be devastating. Women expelled with no social safety net, infants taken from mothers, reputations ruined. Where the accused were clerics, the trail often goes cold. Transfers, quiet retirements, or institutional silence. Behind each of these entries is a mechanism that made abuse possible. First is asymmetry of power. The structure of confinement created dependence. Second is sacramental intimacy. Confession put clerics in positions of privileged access to women's fears, secrets, and bodies. Third is institutional incentive. The imperative to maintain an image of sanctity and moral authority often trumped rigorous inquiry. Together, these produced a system in which coercion and manipulation could occur and be rationalized as spiritual discipline. Psychological dynamics mattered too. Many sisters internalized a moral framework that equated suffering with grace. When a confessor or superior suggested extreme penances, the language of holiness could make refusal not just difficult, but unthinkable. Group dynamics produced contagion. In tightly knit communities under stress, famine, disease, crowded cells, symptoms spread, interpreted according to available categories. In San Placido, for example, the collective nature of convulsions made an explanation of demonic infliction administratively convenient. It required a spiritual intervention that placed the Church at the center. But the same files make clear that the women were often physically depleted and psychologically strained, conditions that modern scholars recognize as fertile ground for mass episodes of distress. We must be careful in our conclusions. The archives are not a single unified indictment. They are messy, contradictory, and shaped by the perspectives of those who wrote them, priests, inquisitors, superiors, and sometimes the women themselves. Yet the aggregate pattern is hard to ignore. Across decades and locations, similar mechanisms recur. When institutions control access to bodies and silence dissent, abuses of power proliferate. Where confessional secrecy is absolute, oversight can be fragile. Where reputation is paramount, victims can be punished at the cost of truth. That does not mean every superior was cruel, nor every confessor corrupt. The historical record also records care, genuine devotion, and acts of protection. Some superiors intervened to limit harm. Some confessors acted to safeguard the health of those in their spiritual charge. The point is systemic. Structures created risks that without adequate checks were exploited. The archives reveal both the faithful and the culpable, sometimes in the same pages. Institutional responses to scandal were also revealing. The Inquisition's investigations could be double-edged. On the one hand, inquisitorial inquiries sometimes brought abuses to light and produced records that now allow historians to reconstruct events. On the other hand, the logic of inquisitorial procedure, focused on spiritual deviance, could obscure material injustices. When the Inquisition arrived at San Placido, it recorded both the symptoms and the living conditions. Yet its interpretive frame prioritized possession as an explanation, and punishments that followed did not necessarily target those with direct access to the sisters' mistreatment. The archive of Lisbon file around Santa Clara, 1624, similarly shows authorities anxious to explain away what might tarnish sanctity. Petitions and testimonies are reinterpreted, and victims' accounts are sometimes discredited as hysteria or deceit. When archival documents do lead to action against a cleric, the path is often labyrinthine. The Vatican correspondence about Father Francisco, 1520, demonstrates that even when central authorities are alerted, their responses are calibrated by politics, ecclesiastical law, and a reluctance to expose scandal. Transfer, recall, or reprimand were steps taken more readily than public trial. For the women affected, the immediate relief was rare. Reputational damage, health consequences, and social exile were more certain. The human cost is unmistakable. Entries in the files mention extended confinement, self-harm described as mortification, and deaths attributed or connected to prolonged deprivation. The archival language is clinical. Notations of weight loss, lists of penances, inventories of possessions taken from a sister deemed disobedient. These clinical notations belie deep suffering. Women who were deprived of food, sleep, and autonomy. Women whose experiences of physical intimacy, whether coerced or exploitative, were buried in the margins of official narratives. At the pivot of these narratives is the question of memory and redress. Archives are selective. Some voices are preserved, others suppressed. Scribes chose what to record. That is why the recovered documents are so valuable and so troubling. They function as both evidence and mirror. Evidence of wrongdoing and a mirror of institutional priorities. They ask us to reckon with the ways authority can sanitize itself and how language, of sanctity, of possession, can obscure material violence. We can draw lessons that are relevant beyond historical curiosity. Institutions that control the bodies and stories of those within them create incentives for secrecy and preservation of image. Where oversight is weak and the guardians of discipline are also the keepers of reputation, the vulnerable are at risk. That pattern resonates in varied modern contexts: boarding schools, psychiatric institutions, closed religious communities, and other enclosed organizations have shown similar dynamics when transparency is lacking and hierarchical power is unchecked. This is not an argument that equates historical convents directly with any modern institution, but a structural analogy. Power concentrated without accountability tends to produce harm. Confronting these archives requires both historical rigor and ethical care. We must be precise in our language, speak of sexual coercion, manipulation, self-harm, or institutional cover-up where supported by documents. Avoid sensational detail that would re-victimize, and always mark claims as coming from specific records. That is why every dramatic-sounding phrase here is tied to a file, a date, a document. The Toledo Inquisitorial File, 1492, records convulsive episodes and penances. The Vatican Correspondence, 1520, raises concerns about a confessor known in the records as Father Francisco. The Archive of Lisbon Dossier, Santa Clara, 1624, records mismatches between official praise and private testimony. The San Placido Inquiry, Madrid 1609, documents mass suffering and the Inquisition's response. These are not sensational headlines detached from evidence. They are the traces left by the institutions themselves. What then should be done with this knowledge? First, preserve and make accessible the records. Shedding light on the past demands custodianship of documents and careful scholarship. Second, center victims' experiences in narrative and remembrance. acknowledging suffering without reducing lives to trauma. Third, use historical understanding to inform contemporary oversight structures. Where secrecy has harmed, transparency and accountability must be prioritized. The final imperative is moral rather than merely academic. To remember. The sisters who suffered, Sister Maria among them, and the unnamed women of San Placido and Santa Clara are more than entries. They were human beings whose bodies and spirits were disciplined in ways the institution interpreted as holy. To remember them is to insist that the language of sanctity not be used to paper over harm, and that institutions bear responsibility for protecting those within their care. If this investigation has struck a chord, the sources that informed this narrative are linked in the description below. The Inquisitorial File, Toledo, 1492, Vatican Correspondence Concerning Father Francisco, 1520, Archive of Lisbon Records Related to Santa Clara, 1624, and the San Placido Inquiry, Madrid, 1609. Check those documents, read them for yourself, and weigh the evidence. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do these archives teach us about the limits of institutional power? And how should we remember those who were confined and silenced? If you want more deep archival investigations like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications. Above all, let the documents be witnesses, so that lives once hidden by ritual and walls are not forgotten.